Hey there, alchemists. So, back 1 week after I graduated from high school, I went to work at a mortgage company with my aunt, and she got me the job. And it was a good job. I made good money. I liked the people that I worked with. I could have all the overtime I wanted. Even after a couple of years, I started going to school part time, but I still never imagined myself getting a degree in something and leaving my job because I made really good money, and I figured that would be the job where I stayed there forever and I retired, right? People used to believe that you could have job security for that long. Okay, so that's old school thinking right there. It was the 80s. It was the 80s. Now, what happened then after I'd been there for 10 years is there was a massive layoff, and I was included in those layoffs. Now, up until that point, I had never considered really what meaning and purpose was in my own life. I just went to work, I played in a band with my husband, we just had fun, and we spent our money. But after I got laid off, what I noticed was that some of the people who got laid off, they were really resentful, and they could not move past that betrayal. Then there were some people who they got laid off and they moved, or they went and got new schooling or retraining, and they got even better jobs. So I decided, like, I wanted to look for meaning and purpose in my life, and I wanted it to be good because I wanted the people like who knew me and knew I got laid off. I wanted people to know, like my old friends, to say, "God, do you hear what that Deanna's up to now?" And so I did. I went looking for a meaning and purpose in my life, and that's how I got into the healing arts. Now, I did want to help people. I did, and I've always loved helping people. But back then, it was my personality driving my search for purpose. And so what I liked was having people say nice things about me, right? And having people talk about me. But see, what was happening to me at that time was that I was finding meaning and purpose through my environment. So if I wasn't feeling good about myself, I would look to my environment for something to make me feel good. And if I couldn't find anything, it usually meant I was taking another class or workshop, adding something into, my bag of tricks as a holistic health practitioner. I didn't know at the time, meaning comes from within us. Our sense of meaning and purpose comes from within us, and it's about knowing ourselves as the divine creators we came here to be. And when I say creator, I'm talking about creating experiences, creating the relationships that fulfill us, connecting with others and being of service to this world, right? Serving as a love amplifier and a grace generator, not servitude, but service. And being a creator means we're expressing ourselves in ways that feel authentic, and they feel good, and they feel fulfilling. Fulfilling. So today, up close and personal, I want to talk about what it takes to connect with meaning and purpose. Now, Carolyn Mace says this about connecting to meaning and purpose, or the quest for meaning and purpose. She says, "It is an inherent yearning to become a whole person, liberated from the fears that pervade the heart and mind and take control of one's life force." So to become a whole and liberated person requires that we align our thoughts with the thoughts of the divine. And this is what opens the way for healing for body, mind, and spirit. Now, those fears that take control of our life, take control of our life force, and they keep us from being a whole person, right? Those are the same fears that keep us from being honest with ourselves. They keep us from being honest about who we are, and they dictate how we show up in our lives. These fears keep us small. So fear, when I say fear, I'm not talking about the kind of fear of fearing for your life, right? Like make you want to go buy a gun, kinds of fears. I'm talking about the fears that come from that disconnection from source. Like we'll never get it handled, we'll never succeed, we'll never have love, we're just going to feel cut off. We're going to feel that void within us, okay? And so those fears can look like a fear of failure, which leads to a fear of being humiliated and shamed. And humiliation and shame are probably about the worst fears, that we deal with. There's fears of disapproval. So we may want people to like us, and we may act like a doormat. We may become a doormat because we don't want somebody to get mad at us because we said no, right? And so we worry about what people think about us and if they'll judge us. There's fear of poverty, right? For those of us who don't have our own independent income, we might worry that if something happened, like where would we go? What would we do? There's also fear of success, right? Because if we succeed, that means that we might have to work harder. We might have to keep showing up. When I did the complaint-free living program for the first time in 2007, and it was funny because you just have to go through 21 days in a row without complaining. It took me several months to do this, but I kept thinking, and my end game was get through the 21 days and just go back to how you were, right? Go back to get through the 21 days, and then you don't have to worry about if you complain or not. What I discovered, because going 21 days and taking several months to do it, it shifted my consciousness. So even when I got to 21 days and I was like, woohoo, I'm done. No, I wasn't done, and I knew it. I knew that I had to keep paying attention to my way of thinking and acting. I didn't want to go back to being a complainer, right? So there's that fear of success. There is the fear of people, like if we do become successful, there's the fear of people leaving us behind because they don't like where we're going. Maybe they don't want to have to show up that way. Okay, there's that fear of that having that constant emptiness within us, that we reach for things in our environment to fill, like food, alcohol, drugs, shopping. Okay, so it's fear that keeps us from being a whole, liberated person and living a life of meaning and purpose. It's that fear. Now, we may think the solution is to make sure that we don't get humiliated or fail or succeed or live in poverty or be judged. We may think that that's the solution. Excuse me. But actually, the solution to becoming a whole, liberated person, those solutions are not found in our physical world, right? We know we can change conditions. We can change conditions. We can manipulate conditions, but eventually the core of our suffering will reemerge in this new life we've just made, right? In this new set of conditions. The core of our suffering will reemerge, right? So Carolyn Mace also says this: the deeper truth that we must ultimately confront is that the healing of the inner self that is required to release us from the depths of suffering and despair is more than an ordinary healing, okay? And make no mistake, the feelings of inadequacy and not being enough and that constant emptiness, that's suffering, okay? That's a form of suffering. So we need more than an ordinary healing, right? We need more than just to be able to, well, I just won't try anything where I can fail, right? I just won't try, right? What we need is to align our thoughts with the thoughts of the divine, because ultimately what we need is a spiritual transformation, right? Because we can't really eradicate those fears. What we have to do is work through those fears. And we do that through a transformation of consciousness. You've probably heard the term, feel the fear and do it anyway, right? That's how we work through our fears. So the solution, right? The only way to become a whole and liberated person is to align our thoughts. The only way to really align our thoughts is to live and act in faith, right? That's how we align our thoughts. Hang on. The dog. Got to get her toy. Right, so the only way, I'm going to go back here, the only way to align our thoughts is to live and act in faith. And the way that we live and act in faith is to trust and act on our intuition, right? Act on intuition, act on that divine guidance, right? However you want to call it, or whatever you want to call it. Listening to intuition and acting on faith, though, these are the challenge because they're not considered reasonable actions or reasonable responses, if we are feeling like we're facing an obstacle. But see, here's the thing. I know many people who tell me that they are very intuitive, right? Very hyper intuitive. But most of us are willing to listen to our intuition when it's not a big deal, right? When it's something we're going to do that just doesn't require a huge sacrifice. Okay, like if you get inspired to drive out to Palm Springs for the day, right? Of course, taking into account that you live within driving distance of Palm Springs. But maybe you decide, yeah, just drive to Palm Springs for the day. And there's really not a huge sacrifice in that. I mean, you'll buy a tank of gas and you'll buy food and maybe some touristy kind of little treasures. But there's not a huge sacrifice. Most very intuitive people share the story of, well, I always get a parking place right up front. And in fact, my girlfriend calls it Doris Day parking because in all the old Doris Day movies, Doris Day always gets a parking spot right up front, right in front of wherever she goes, okay? But there's just not a huge, we don't lose anything if we don't find a parking place, right? If you get the urge to call an old friend and, so you call an old friend, right? You just connect. Now, it is a lot different if anybody were to receive the intuitive nudge to quit their job, sell their house, and move across the country. All right, that is so huge, right? And even like if you were to hear that intuitively, you might even feel right off the bat that feels right, that feels exciting, and as you think about it, like you get even more enthusiasm for the idea, right? You're just like, yeah, I want to move across the country. But then you start thinking about the details, like how would you manage this? Well, you'd have to job hunt and you'd have to put your house on the market and give notice. And what if you couldn't find a job right away? And what if your house sold, but then you had nowhere to go? And then all of a sudden this idea of quitting your job, selling your house and moving across the country, it doesn't seem so reasonable anymore. Doesn't seem so reasonable. And so it's those bits of divine guidance that are going to be harder for us to listen to, right? Because we have a lot to lose, right? There could potentially be a lot to lose. So when we're residing in our minds, okay, our intellect, our reason, we're going to look for reasonable actions to make things better, right? We're gonna look for those guarantees. If, it has to happen this way, A, B, C. And if it doesn't happen that way, then forget it. I'm not going to do it, right? And we look for things to fall into place and make sense before we commit to taking action, right? That's what happens when we live within just our mind. And this is where we're going to start experiencing conflict. Our reason is determined to keep us in our comfort zone, keep us where everything's safe, keep us where we can have the guarantee. But our soul, which speaks to us through intuition, through divine guidance, through direction, it wants us to become curious about the unexplored possibilities. Okay, so our meaningful life, it cannot emerge until we choose to live in congruence with our divine nature. To listen and act, right? And as we listen and act, we're guided out of, she's got this giant antler, so noisy. But as we listen and act in faith, we're guided more toward opportunities, right? We're guided into these new situations. We're guided into places where we can become curious about the unexplored possibilities. And this is walking by faith. Okay, this is walking by faith. It doesn't mean that we have to spend a bunch of money. Really, it doesn't. I've shared the story of how I came to be minister of Unity. That I was hired in January of 2019, but I got my first bit of direction in January of 2017 because I asked, what do I do next? Right? I asked that question. And the answer I got did not make sense. It was unreasonable. Okay? Now, I continued to follow divine guidance for the next 2 years. I listened and acted on everything that I was aware of, right? And the thing is that these actions, they didn't cost me money. I didn't even have to leave like a 50-mile radius of where I live to act on this intuitive guidance. But I was put into situations where I was very uncomfortable because it was with new people. And I'm pretty introverted by nature. And so going to a new crowd of people is really uncomfortable. Right? I would have rather spent the money. Okay. So we're still, of course, listening and acting on faith, living a life in faith, walking by faith. We're going to face the things that make us really uncomfortable. Okay. Now our reasoning mind, it's the one that's going to think this is going to cost money, time, maybe lots of physical effort. Okay, but for sure, what it's going to cost us is our comfort. That's what it's going to cost, our comfort. Right? As we live and walk in faith, we're learning to be okay with being uncomfortable. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16 to 18, this is a directive on walking in faith. And it says, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed because the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Now, you could break this down. Basically, when one turns to the Lord, right? The Lord is our I am consciousness, right? The Jehovah within us, the Christ consciousness within us. When we turn to our I am consciousness, we align with the divine within us, and the veil is removed. Well, the veil are all of those fears that we have of not being enough in some form, right? I don't want to fail. I'm afraid of being humiliated, right? I'm afraid of, people judging me. Okay, so those are all those fears. Those are removed. The veil is lifted. Our need for a guarantee is now taken out of the equation because the Lord is the Spirit. Okay, our I am consciousness is part of that Spirit, that source of all things, right? The all, right? That is all things. We're an idea in the mind of God. And so we always have access to source. And that means solutions and direction and ideas and inspiration. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. When we align with our divine within us, our fears are pushed aside. And basically, anything is possible, right? Because God works through us and God works through everything around us because God is all things. So what we do next is guided by that, and this opens the way, right? All the big fears, all those big fears, right? The fear of not being enough, because those are pushed aside, right? The veil is lifted. We start recognizing our true self. We recognize our true self. We let our light shine through and into our life. And this is how we experience a transformation of consciousness. As we listen and act in faith, we are transforming our consciousness, right? And we become empowered by the divine within us. We become empowered by our inner resources, our inner resourcefulness. We become empowered, right? We experience a transformation of consciousness every time we listen and act in faith, okay? And we're becoming more of ourselves, and we think and we act from love. So we're called forth that power that creates worlds. We call forth that power that creates worlds, and it's now creating through us, for us, and as us. Okay? So here's our call to action for this week. I'll say our affirmation first, and then we'll say it together. I am a blessing to others by being myself. Okay, one more time. I am a blessing to others by being myself. Those big fears, right, of us not being enough or good enough, that's what keeps us in suffering, right? Those big fears. That's what keeps us in suffering. And we can't show up the way we want to if we are in that suffering. We can't show up the way we want to for ourselves. We cannot show up the way we want to for each other or for the people in our lives that we love, right? As long as we stay stuck in that suffering, we cannot show up. Now, I'm going to read to you a revamped unity version or New Thought version of that verse from 2 Corinthians, okay? When I align with the divine within, my fears are pushed aside. And because God is all things, and that means me, I am free to be as God created me. Okay? So here is our invitation for this week. We can do this together. Becoming more in harmony with our intuitive selves. It is not dependent on our conditions or resources. It's not dependent on conquering our big fears. It's not dependent on money or time or popularity. Okay? Healing in our body, mind, spirit, so we become a whole, liberated person, starts with this one thing: aligning with the divine within us. Which is why, our principles are God is all things, and that means me. And I align more deep, God is all things, and that means me. I create my experiences through my way of thinking and acting. And through meditation, affirmative prayer, right? I align more deeply with the infinite within me. And it's not enough to know these things, we must live them, right? This is why we say all this all the time. This is why these are our unity principles, right? This is how we become a whole, liberated person. So this week, think about the moment where you need things to be reasonable and make sense. Just think about it. And not all things we need to be reasonable are bad, right? Some of them are good. It's if you're going to go and purchase something, it's reasonable to think you'll get something for the money that you spent, okay? But I'm talking about, think about, like if this comes up, you need a moment to be reasonable because you want the guarantee that you won't fail, okay? Think about if you're feeling stuck and frustrated, are you needing a guarantee? Okay, is that what you're needing? And if this happens, remind yourself, God is all things, and that means me. And that power that creates worlds creates through me. Right? God is all things, and that means solutions and inspiration and ideas and direction, right? And intuitive nudges, right? God is all things. And this is how we activate our inner resources so that we are moving more toward being a whole and liberated person. Because this is how we are creating heaven on earth. So remember that you are divinely designed to be doing all of these things. You are a one-time, one-of-a-kind cosmic event in everything you do. You are blessed, mwah, and so it is.